you go to the climate negotiations and you think that's going to be a big driving force, that people are going to be really focusing their attention on this challenge that we're facing, the window of opportunity that we've got. We see that climate change is actually happening. You know, we know that the ice glaciers are melting. We know the damage to the ecosystem. We know that our window of opportunity to actually, before we get to the tipping point, before we're unable to actually do anything about catastrophic climate change, is rapidly closing, that's what would be the motivating driving force, and that's where people's attention will be focused. It's not. It is about economic power, and it is about political power. That fundamentally is the driving force as to what is being discussed there, which really lends us to, actually, what do we do as a movement? You know, where are we? When we talk about the climate justice movement, and what do we actually need to do? And it's clear that the biggest challenge we've got is actually a fundamental transformation of the industrial economies, the system that we live in, because that is no longer tenable. And to be able to do that, I think there's two elements of that. You know, one, it's clearly understanding what are the systemic causes that are driving climate change. And secondly, how do we promote the solutions which are actually going to create this sort of just, environmentally sustainable society that we want, not just here in the north, but in the south. How do we create global equity and a new vision of the world? And I think that's partly what Cochabamba tried to do. Not only try to talk about what are some of the challenges we face, but what is our vision? You know, what is the sort of world that we're going to try and live in? But first, you know, for us, I think as a climate justice movement, we have to recognise that, you know, the reason we call ourselves a climate justice movement, we don't call ourselves a climate movement, we call it a climate justice movement, is to be able to tackle the injustices of climate. We recognise that already, you know, the people who are facing the impacts of climate change are disproportionately in the global south. Yes, of course, there are communities and here in the global north, poor communities that do face impacts of climate change. And we see that already when the impacts of floods here in Britain, and who was affected in Hull, who's still living in sort of caravans, who wasn't rehoused, who's facing impacts in terms of higher food prices, all of those things. But fundamentally, you know, it's people in the global south whose homes and territories are being affected. That it's their deterioration of the agricultural land and the water systems. You know, something like 50% of the agricultural system around the world will collapse by 2020 unless we tackle climate change. That's going to condemn millions of people to hunger. We see already millions of people are going to be faced by water scarcity. Something like 75 million to 250 million more people will have to face the impacts of water scarcity. The 60 million indigenous people and the 1.6 billion people who rely on forests for their livelihoods are going to be impacted, or are impacted now, as we see the forest dieback, the forest fires that we're seeing, and also some of the solutions that are being proposed there. We know that millions of people are going to be affected in terms of their health, in terms of disease, in terms of hunger. And that's really got to be our motivating factor. That actually what our climate justice movement has got to be about is about acting in solidarity, is about acting with and for those communities. And that really means for us in the north, our challenge is to actually stop those unjust solutions. Because all the world sees that these things are happening. But actually what is being proposed as real solutions are out there is incredible. You know, which we've heard, you know, rich countries, you know, the rich industrialised countries, whether it's 15 or 20% of the world's population, we're responsible for 3/4 of the world's global emissions. And yet, the biggest fight that we're facing at the moment is around targets. What sort of targets and how much emissions cuts will rich countries commit to? At the moment, in the Copenhagen Accord, they're putting forward emissions cuts which are going to condemn the world to a 3.9% temperature increase. That's what the world will go to. Sorry, 3.9 degrees temperature increase. You know, even the IPCC, the most conservative, said at 2 degrees is their threshold, and we've got a 50% chance of reaching that if we have 40% emissions cuts. You know what the US has put on the table? 3% emissions cuts on 1990 level. You know what the European Union is putting on the table? 20% emissions cuts for the second commitment period. And of that 20%, 11% is already been done because of the recession. Of the other 8%, half of it is going to be met by offsets. Offsets, great. We don't have to do anything. No, our lifestyle doesn't change. Instead, we buy the right, that space, the atmospheric space in developing countries, and say, well, we've cut the emissions there. We look at, the creation of the carbon markets, the biggest drive that we're seeing. The main thing that came out of the European Heads of State meeting that was held last week was two things. One, saying we're going to keep to a 20% emissions cuts, and that came because of the very, very heavy lobbying by vested interests. And the second thing was about the expansion of the global carbon market. Here we've seen the economic crisis, these bankers who've gambled the world's wealth, and now they see carbon markets. They see this is going to be the biggest. This is going to be the biggest market. It's the biggest commodity market in the world, they reckon. They reckon it's going to be worth trillions and trillions of dollars. And already we're seeing company after company, particularly here in the city, British companies, European companies. We've got Shell, we've got Gazprom, everybody already buying into the carbon markets, because what they hope in Cancun is there'll be a green light for a global carbon market. And that's one of the things that we've got to stop. And we've got to stop it, and that's linked to the whole thing around RED, around how do we stop deforestation. 20% of the world's global emissions are from deforestation. So you think, stop deforestation, it's critical. We could stop 20% of the world's global emissions. Now, 50% of those emissions are due to illegal logging in two countries, Brazil and Indonesia. The most fundamental thing you'd think would be, brilliant, let's try and stop illegal logging. Let's put land rights, let's do, work with those local communities who live and their livelihoods are based in terms of on those forests and ecosystems. That would be the simplest and easiest system to be able to do. Instead, no, what we've got is the US and the UK and the EU saying, no, the way to do it is promote these global carbon markets, where what you do is you allow companies to be able to buy up the forests. But you know where it was natural forest before? It doesn't matter. Cut down the natural forest, plant a plantation, a monoculture plantation, still get the same amount of credits for it, even though it's 1/5 of the, it captures 1/5 of the carbon, it destroys the ecosystem, the lives of people around us. And that's some of the things that we've got to stop. And that's why I disagree with people who say Cancun isn't important. In fact, Cancun is critical for the movement. Because you know what we're trying to do in Cancun? We're trying to stop bad things happening. We're trying to stop the worst things that are happening. We're trying to stop the World Bank gaining control of climate finance. We're trying to stop the global carbon markets. We're trying to stop offsetting. And that's why we've got to do these things. Because when we talk about, we've got to stop this neoliberal drive for economic growth. We're living on a finite planet. They think we've got infinite resources. They're raping and pillaging. Every year, we consume over 30% more of the world's resources than there are out there. And, who's consuming those? Those aren't 3/4 of the world. Those are 20% of people in the world. And it's interesting that Todd Stern, the lead negotiator for the US, he says very clearly, says the thing that's not negotiable, that's not up for negotiation, is the lifestyle of the American population. Even though their per capita emissions are 20 times those of emissions, per capita emissions of the rest of the world. Even though their footprint, their carbon footprint, their water footprint, everything is so incredibly intense. And yet we're seeing very, very little action in terms of that. And the reason we're seeing that is because actually the power of corporate interests. And the corporate interests have captured a lot of the negotiations. Something like, I think there's 30,000 people were listed for Copenhagen in terms of the negotiations. Something like 20,000 of them are corporate lobbyists. From private companies, from the World Bank, from all of these from these companies. At the European Union, there's 18,000 corporate lobbyists lobbying every single day to make sure that the European Union's position is as weak as possible, that it doesn't challenge their vested interests. That's why we've got to be able to take them on. Now, how do you take them on? It's not just about abstract taking them on. And this is where I think the climate justice movement is doing incredible work. Here in the UK is doing incredible work. It's by showing solidarity with people in Nigeria who are taking on Shell. It's by showing solidarity and taking on RBS and the tar sands. It's by taking on the oil companies here. It's by taking on our companies, because our companies are which are driving those vested interests and are driving the economic forces which are allowing these corporates to live. It's about us taking on Monsanto, which are pushing for GM crops to be the solution in terms of the agricultural crisis. So really what we've got to do is we've got to build a movement that not just is way out there, but a movement that links on the inside, because we know what's happening on the inside. As John said, Bolivia's been the moral compass. Bolivia have been standing out there. And the whole strategy that we've seen from the US and from the European Union and from other rich countries is, how do we isolate Bolivia? How do we make sure that Bolivia and the progressive voices are silenced? They tried it in Copenhagen with the Copenhagen Accord. They silenced everybody else, all the voices that they thought would make a problem, all 175 of them. They come up with a secret document. They pull it at 2 o'clock in the morning. Ed Miliband runs and holds it in his hand, and at 2:10 and says, you know, we've saved the world, we've saved the world. We condemn the world, that document did. But, you know, so it's a challenge, I think, for us in terms of the movement, is not to forget what's going on inside the negotiations, but also to link that with outside. We saw it in Copenhagen. We had 100,000 people on the streets in Copenhagen. Now that's, in one sense, you can say it's incredible. 100,000 people, brilliant, the largest climate demonstration that we've seen in Europe. Pales into insignificance when you think of the millions we turned out against the war. And it shows the challenge that we've got in terms of the movement to be able to build and how we build it forward. And in Cancun, the great thing about in terms of Cancun is that the movements are building. Because what we're trying to do inside the negotiations is about creating space. The link with Cochabamba was that Cochabamba brought the movements together and explained and made people understand that every single fight that we've got, every single fight is ultimately linked to the climate negotiations. About a right to development, a right to food, a right to shelter, a life, the economic system, everything about equality. If you were interested in gender equality, 70% of the world's food is produced by women who are going to be disproportionately affected. Every single issue. And it was about bringing those movements together and saying, there is a fight. This fight is actually more important and a bigger fight than the fight we had around the WTO. Because this is actually about the future of the world and all of humanity in it. And so, you know, so we need to link inside. And they'll tell you the real importance of why we've got to link on the inside. When we say stop Bolivia being isolated, you know, last year in Barcelona, there was a moment where one of the negotiating groups, the Africa group, you know, walked out of the negotiations, yeah, said we're not going to negotiate anymore in this negotiation until rich countries commit what their targets. They put their targets. It's been 7 months. That's what they were meant to have done. For 7 months, people have been waiting and waiting and waiting. And the lead negotiator there was a guy called Kamal, who's from Algeria. You know, and they walked out at 5 o'clock. We held a protest in their support. You know, at 9 o'clock the next morning, where's Kamal? Oh, he's been recalled. Already, rich Paris, London, all of these countries on their phones, ringing developing countries and saying, get rid of these negotiators who are causing a problem. You know, John talks about, you know, Bernadita's. We know the challenge, how many of the developed countries want to get rid of her as a negotiator from the negotiation. So those sort of tactics, those bullying tactics, you see poor countries, developing countries, who know that actually what's on the table is nothing. You know, who are basically being told, listen, there's 30 billion in short-term climate finance, even though most of it, there's a great WDM report on climate finance sitting over there. You know, the majority of that climate finance has been taken from overseas development aid. And they're saying, we know there's nothing, we're not going to be given anything. The US telling countries, if you oppose the Copenhagen Accord, you're not going to get any financial aid from us. That Ecuador and Bolivia being told you're not going to get any financial aid if any country opposes the US position in terms of the climate negotiations. That's why we've got to be able to link on the inside. I'm told to shut up, I will.
2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. And that's why outside of the negotiations, it's always really important, not just at the big negotiations, not just at the COP at Copenhagen and Cancun. Every time they meet, those negotiators meet, we as a movement also have to be outside. We have to be inside and outside, because we have to be able to hold and stiffen the resolve of our countries, of our countries in the developing south. We have to make sure that it's not just Bolivia standing up, that we are lobbying each and every one of our countries to stand. And those of us in the north are doing damage limitation, are holding our leaders to account, are holding the UK government to account in terms of what it says here and what it does in terms of the negotiations. And the third most important thing, we have to have a movement that's outside, that's completely outside, that's building the real alternatives, that's talking about what sort of vision have we got in terms of a new and just society, what sort of just transition are we going to have, how do we protect food sovereignty, how do we protect community rights, linking all of those things, and overwhelmingly linking those three sections of our one movement to be able to say what is a real structural change that we need to see. And that's got the biggest challenge, I think, for the climate justice movement. We are in infancy. That's absolutely clear. But you know, as we go towards Cancun, the most important thing that we people have got to remember is, you know, after Copenhagen, I think a lot of people had a headache, you know, hangover, and thought, oh my God, you know, we all had so much hopes for Copenhagen, and they all came crashing down. Well, I didn't. I think most of us here didn't have great hopes for Copenhagen. What we said was Copenhagen is an important moment. It's not the be-all and end-all. This fight is a long fight. It's not going to be over in a year. And the climate justice movement needs to continuously be building and creating the space and the time to be able to build and link with those new movements. And that's partly why Cancun is really, really important, to stop those bad things happening, to be able to provide the space and the time for us to build a movement strong enough to be able to make the challenges that we need to face. So I would really, really urge all of you, you know, when you leave this, or if you take some material, please do leave your names and addresses if you want to take part in online actions. There's all sorts of stuff happening. There's, of course, massive demonstrations happening in Cancun. There's a massive demonstration happening in Brussels in terms of in support of 1,000 Cancuners, which was the call that came out of Cochabamba, saying to people, you don't need to be in Cancun to show solidarity. You don't need to be in Cancun to raise your voice for climate justice. You can be wherever you are, we need to be raising your voice. And so what we're trying to do here in the UK is build people to say, when we need people to be outside of the American embassy, we will have people outside the American embassy saying, we're not going to allow you to frame the debate the way that you did in Copenhagen, where you walked off scot-free and you talked about China. Actually, the villain in the piece was the developed countries. I'm going to stop, and I will stop. I'm very grateful.